In March 1989, a bit of understeer in a VLCC resulted in her grounding and spilling over 1 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound, Alaska. The resulting cleanup and litigation cost her owner over $3 billion, and it remained the largest spill in US history until the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. But that leads us to the question, how could such a simple mistake happen, especially when it had such devastating consequences? Late in the evening of 22nd of March 1989, the VLCC Exxon Valdez arrived at her loading terminal on the southern side of Port Valdez, Alaska, to prepare for her cargo of crude oil. A VLCC literally means a very large crude carrier, which, in the case of the Exxon Valdez, meant a total length of almost 1,000 feet and a capacity to carry almost 1.5 million barrels of crude oil. Anyway, at 23:50 that night, she was all connected up, so soon commenced pumping her ballast water ashore. The ballast had been taken on elsewhere to make the vessel sit low enough in the water to safely travel to Alaska. The thing is, microscopic organisms within the water are not native to Alaska, so when it comes to discharge, you can't just dump it over the side, you pump it ashore for treatment. Anyway, a few hours later, at 5:05 in the morning, Exxon Valdez completed the ballast discharge and commenced loading her crude oil cargo. It continued over the course of the entire day, giving some of the crew the opportunity to have a run ashore. Around 7:30 that evening, loading was complete, so the crew that were on board prepared Exxon Valdez for sea. By 8:20, the harbour pilot was on, followed 10 minutes later by the ship's master, who'd just returned from ashore, having originally thought departure would be somewhat later on. Anyway, all was good, so they cast off the lines and began moving off with the assistance of a couple of tugs. By 9:20, they were clear of the berth, so allowed one tug to manoeuvre astern to become the escort and released the other. Together, they made their way westwards before turning into the Valdez Narrows on their way towards the open sea. Once clear, the pilot set a course of 219 degrees, taking them down towards the pilot station, where he disembarked around 23:24, just before Exxon Valdez joined the outbound traffic lane. The master, concerned about the glacial ice flowing out of Columbia Bay, advised the local VTC that they'd be altering course and probably end up in the inbound traffic lane. Exxon Valdez then made a series of alterations to port, eventually coming around to 180 degrees. As he had some paperwork to complete, the master handed over to the officer on the bridge, with the plan being to continue on until Busby Island Light was abeam to port, then return the vessel to the traffic lanes. Eventually, when the light was abeam, the officer took a bearing and went straight to plot it on the chart. Out on the starboard wing, the lookout reported another light, approximately 45 degrees on the starboard bow, flashing once every 5 seconds. The officer acknowledged it as Bligh Reef buoy number 6, which he'd already identified. After completing the fix at 23:55, the officer ordered starboard 10 on the rudder to follow the captain's instructions of bringing the vessel back to the traffic lanes. A couple of minutes later, he noticed that the ship's heading hadn't changed and that the vessel hadn't come off a previous track, so ordered the rudder starboard 20 instead. At this point, the lookout came to report that Bligh Reef buoy number 6, still on the starboard side, was flashing once every 4 seconds instead of once every 5. Looking at the radar, it seemed that although the ship's heading was finally swinging the correct way, she was still following a 180-degree track. Concerned, the officer ordered hard to starboard on the rudder while continuing to monitor the radar. A few seconds later, he called the master and said, "I think we're in serious trouble." At that point, Exxon Valdez started to experience a series of sharp jolts as she ran aground on the northern end of Bligh Reef. Upon feeling the vessel movement, the chief officer first went to the bridge, then to the cargo control room, where he noticed that all the starboard and centre cargo tanks were rapidly discharging and that the previously full ballast tanks 2 and 4 starboard were filling up. Exxon Valdez was leaking oil. By 1 in the morning, so much cargo had gone that the ship would no longer be able to survive if she left the reef. She was completely stuck. So, what happened? Was it seriously just a simple case of a junior officer failing to appreciate that more than 10 degrees of rudder was needed? Well, as you're probably expecting, there was somewhat more to it than that, but it does all come back to that turn. Investigative simulations have shown that they started the turn around 1.4 miles past Busby Island Light, rather than when it was abeam. Given the ship was 1,000 feet long and running at speed, this does tie in if the officer took a few minutes confirming position before beginning the turn. Nonetheless, had they made the turn with a consistent 10 degrees of helm, she should still have cleared the reef. Instead, it looks like the helm was actually eased a few times and possibly even counter-helm used to slow the rate of turn. This resulted in the equivalent of using an average of 4 or 5 degrees of rudder instead of 10. Interestingly, had an average of 4 or 5 degrees of helm been used from Busby Island Light, it would also have resulted in the Exxon Valdez passing clear of the reef. Anyway, although the cause of the helm easing isn't clear, it could be that the helmsman didn't realise the intentions of the officer, so maintained a steady turn rather than allowing it to accelerate. Of course, an experienced officer like the one on duty should have been monitoring the rudder and immediately picked up when it was eased, so that leads us to think there must be more to it. Well, if we look back earlier in the day, we start to find some answers. The ship had arrived the night before and spent all day loading cargo. It could be that the officer was exhausted and not performing at his best. You see, although an accident such as this seems like a simple case of not making the turn, when we delve into it, we find there are so many factors we actually need to consider. Was the helmsman wrong for easing the turn? Was the officer wrong for failing to monitor the helmsman? Was the master wrong for leaving a junior officer on the bridge? Was the VTC wrong for failing to monitor the ship's progress, especially after being told that they'd be leaving the traffic lanes? Were the crew exhausted after having departed so soon after spending the entire day loading cargo? Was, ultimately, the ship owner in the wrong for placing those crew members on the vessel or for implementing the working conditions that eventually led to the accident? At the end of the day, when it comes to these investigations, it doesn't actually matter who was to blame. What matters is working out the series of events that coincided to cause this accident and determining what steps to take to break that chain of events in the future. In this particular case, we had a VLCC run aground in an environmentally sensitive area and spill 10.8 million gallons of crude oil into the water. For decades, it was the largest ever spill in US waters until the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. It's estimated that the ship's owner ended up paying around $2 billion in cleanup costs and another $1 billion in civil and criminal charges. The accident also led to a number of rule changes and new regulations for ships around the world. Internationally, it led to the development of the MARPOL Convention, which is all about preventing pollution from ships, including through the phasing in of double-hull tankers. In the US, it led to the Oil Pollution Act, which, as well as double hulls, also banned vessels which have caused a spill of over 1 million gallons of oil from entering Prince William Sound. As for the Exxon Valdez herself, she was refloated and repaired before being renamed the Exxon Mediterranean. Over the following years, she changed names and owners a few more times before eventually being beached and scrapped in 2012. If you would like more information about this accident, I've linked the report down in the description below so you can go and check that out, though they've summarised it rather well in a single paragraph. The probable cause of the grounding of the Exxon Valdez was the failure of the third mate to properly manoeuvre the vessel because of fatigue and excessive workload, the failure of the master to provide a proper navigation watch because of impairment from alcohol, the failure of Exxon's shipping company to provide a fit master and a rested and sufficient crew for the Exxon Valdez, the lack of an effective vessel traffic service because of inadequate equipment and manning levels, inadequate personnel training and deficient management oversight, and the lack of effective pilotage services.